What was it like for you as a writer to go through that process?
Well, I thought it would be easier than it was. But the point is that the build-up of detail about the barbarity of humans lives with you all the time because you're obsessed with it. You think just like a journalist thinks, I can get in, get the story, and get out. But it doesn't always happen. It stays with you. And I can remember having a very dark time in the middle of the book. But my dark time was nothing like the dark time the former prisoners had had.
How long was the dark time?
A month. It happens to a lot of writers that they have a crisis in the middle of their book. And in the middle of their book, they can lose faith in what they're doing. And that's terrible because it takes so long to get to that point.
So actually you got two crises going on. One is the writer's crisis in the middle of the book. And the other is the emotional crisis because you have to you really melt yourself into these stories before you can put them onto the paper.
People had died to make this story. Schindler saved a small number, but people had died as part of this story, and I couldn't forget that and couldn't fail to be haunted by it.
How did you struggle against yourself in order to get out of that trap?
Well, I lived in Sydney on a beach, a surfing beach. So I would go to the beach, a long way from Europe. I would go to football matches. I would go to restaurants and drink wine. So gradually, after a couple of weeks, you begin to feel better about it. You get your strength and you get your psychological strength and your courage back.
So namely, Australia helps you. The great outdoor and the great wine.
Absolutely. Writing it in the new world instead of in the old world where it happened was a great help.
Movies about wars usually could fall into a trap. Good men versus bad men. Good people versus bad people. But in your book, I find it a bit more complicated than that. I
should disclaim that I ever spoke to Schindler. If I'd had a chance to talk to him, I know I would have liked him because the stories were about him being a good guy, relaxed, a man who had no money at that stage of his life, but who always over-tipped, a man who had no money but could always find the money to buy another cognac. I'm sure I would have liked him. He, like I, was a Catholic. And were not the sort of Catholics bishops would have approved of. And so I liked the fact that he was a Catholic. On top of that, he was flawed. I wouldn't have to be reverent to him because he was a bad husband. He used people as cheap labor.
Yes, because that's why he wanted to have these people originally. And he always wanted to be rich. He always intended he'd make a killing out of the war. And at the end of the war, he lost everything, of course. And after the war, he couldn't get back into being wealthy because he didn't have those Jewish engineers who were his prisoners and the Jewish accountants to look after him. So it's a great contradiction, a man who can only succeed when society's turned upside down and can chiefly succeed when he has help from his prisoners, at the same time respects the humanity of his prisoners. And he, at the end of the film and of the book, his prison was full. Now, when I say that mention the film, that's one of my small criticisms about the film. I think the film is a fine film. But at the end of the film, he says, if I'd sold this badge, I could have saved one more. If I'd sold the car, I could have saved 10 more.
In fact, his camp was already very full. While wanting to be sincerely rich, he had an amiable regard for the humanity of these other people. He knew that they were his brothers in the human race, as simple as that. At the same time as being a black marketeer, a scoundrel, and a great, he could confuse officials. He could bombard them with documentation, he could bribe them with diamonds, as he does in the film and does even more in the book. And he was an extraordinarily confident man.
So the question really is, what is this really about? Is this about bigger cause, or this is about the bottom line of human instinct?
Yes, it's interesting that you can indoctrinate people to hate other people, and the indoctrination is often successful with quite intelligent people. Oskar was a boy from the country, and yet he's
an outlier in a way. He's almost like an outlier in a way.
Yes, indeed. He is too much of a rebel to be influenced by the conditioning that says to the children and to adolescents and to others, you must hate this group because they're a danger to your civilization. And they're not human anyhow. So you don't have to, they're louse. You don't have to worry about killing them off. It's interesting that he evaded that, that conditioning. And in any case, he was a part of the book that he was an agent of German military intelligence as well. So he was spying for them on the SS, and that was an interesting part of his. But when the film was made and Spielberg cut it down, it was 6.5 hours long, and then he cut it down to 3.25. So he did a good job to get it down to 3.25. But he had to just concentrate on this idea of rescue and ambiguity. What I liked about Spielberg, who should I be to say, why should I be the one to say that when he's a far more famous director than I am a writer? But the truth is that I respected his taste for showing in the film just how mixed Oscar's motives were, just how ambiguous he was.
Mr. Keneally, what is it like for you? I mean, as a writer, the book was big.
Yes.
You won a Booker Prize for it. Then it was getting even bigger because of the movie. But you know, the book itself was about the worst nature of human being. The book itself is about hundreds of thousands of deaths during the war, and the uncertainty of human nature for the future. How do you read so many messages all at the same time personally?
I was raised a Catholic. I don't think I'm a Catholic anymore, but we were told that we had original sin, that we were born imperfect. And that imperfection, that struggle between reason and brutalism, brutal reactions, that we're given our reason to try to control. That struggle has just always fascinated me from childhood, in myself too. One of the reasons I wanted to write that book was to ask myself, how would I have behaved in that situation?
How did you think?
Am I confident that I wouldn't, under the orders of my officers and under the conditioning of a young lifetime, do what they did? And I'm scared that I don't know the answer. I'm scared that I might. And so the I deliberately set out to pluck those strands out because, as you say, people had died in great numbers and they deserved that their deaths shouldn't be written off simply, that the full complexity of both death and survival and of goodness and malice. And the prisoners told me this. The prisoners said, whenever we met Schindler after the war, we would ask him why he did it. Mm-hmm. And it depended on the day. He'd say one thing, then in a couple of days' time he'd completely contradict himself. Then he'd say something again the following week and so on. Every time they asked him that question, Poldek said it was a different answer.
It was decades ago when you wrote the book.
Yes. I was young. I had a little bit of hair.
And now, very different. Decades later, you learn life much more than you did then, I guess.
Yes.
And you go through this huge fame, a lot of spotlights as a result of it. You are now much more matured, shall I say,
yes,
than you used to be. When you reflect upon what you wrote and this man, have things changed in your mind?
No, in fact, it's interesting. The thing that always worried me is that despite all the evidence for the story I told, ultimately someone would come along with another story and say, no, he got it all wrong. This is, Schindler's had a third motive for, and that hasn't happened. Now, Mrs. Schindler...
Were you scared about that possibility?
I was scared about that possibility. Mrs. Schindler said at the time that she was never consulted, but she was, both by myself and by Spielberg, exhaustively. But the point was that she was his abandoned wife. She was in an interesting position. A man who's left you suddenly becomes a hero to the world and a byword for goodwill to other humans.
That's right.
And he didn't show you much goodwill. And so she was angry with, I think, with the fact that her husband has become a famous man and a byword for human sensitivity, human kindness. And but her story is part of the fascination of the story for an outsider, because her story of him is very ambiguous. And a lot of people said when it came to feeding women by hand, sick women by hand, she was the one who'd do that in the camp. Oskar was too busy drinking and talking and, doing big stuff.
It's a very interesting man, isn't it?
Yes, he is. And I don't think he was a philosopher or a saint, you see. If he'd been a saint, he could only have died with those people. He couldn't have saved them.
But the question is, has there ever been a saint?
Well, that's a good question to ask an old Catholic. Possibly not. There've always been, we have always been, there have been men and women who know themselves and try to, and because they know themselves, they're kind to others. And that is a great thing. It's a wonder we're not all killers, because we're pretty savage animals, but we're not. We can sit together and talk. And I would hate to think of you starving. I would bring you food.
Because that's your moral bottom line.
Yes, but if I was shot for bringing you food, would I still bring you the food? That's the acid test.
All interesting questions to be raised. You love history.
Yes, indeed, I've written a lot of history.
Some say history is only the version of story that the winners wants to tell.
Ah, yes, but novelists tell about history so they can tell the true story from the point of view of ordinary people. So novelists are great subversives. It is true the victors tell the story, but some events are so huge and there's so much documentation for them that you can't escape them.
So actually, who is writing fictions? The writers, the novelists, or the historians?
Well, I think we're both writing, but historians do more research. I've written history too, and you can't escape the person you are when you write history. So it's as if if you wrote a history and I wrote a history, it's like having a big mass of dough called history and some cookie cutters. You have those in China, don't you?
We do.
And you're one cookie cutter, and you cut your cookie out of that massive dough, and I'm a different cookie cutter. You're shaped like a diamond, I'm shaped like a spade, and so my version of that dough will be different from your version.
History needs a lot of missionaries who can really talk about at least what they saw ever happened.
Yes, and may they continue to come. I can't wait for the novels of a new generation of Chinese writers.
Mr. Keneally, what a pleasure.
Thank
you
you
once again for
very
sharing
much.
your precious time.
Thank you.